'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking
From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring juvenile recidivism. That's right, juvenile recidivism with Dr. Richard Redding. He's the Vice Chancellor and Professor of Law, Psychology, and Education at Chapman University. Let's welcome to the circle, Dr. Redding. Welcome to the circle.
Thank you.
So this is an interesting topic because obviously it deals with our youth. It deals with the safety of everybody in America. So let's start off with juvenile crime stats. Are we getting worse or is it getting better for us?
Well, the good news is it's been getting significantly better in recent years. We saw a spike in juvenile crime, especially violent crime, in the late 70s and early 80s, which caused states to respond by passing a number of so-called get tough laws on juvenile crime. But ever since about 1995, we've seen a gradual drop-off in juvenile crime, especially in recent years. And juvenile crime is an especially fitting topic to talk about when you're talking about crime in general, because there's a old saying in criminology that crime, especially violent crime, is the work of the young and the work of men. The work of young men.
Really?
So, yes.
Is there a high propensity for young men then for violent crimes?
Those are, if you look at who commits the majority of violent crimes, it's overwhelmingly young men. There's kind of an age effect where you reach a certain age and they kind of mature out of it. You know, if you look at who it is that's committing violent crime, not only in the United States, but that's a worldwide phenomenon, it's mostly young men.
So we don't have to worry about Charlie Manson anymore?
Well, I don't know about that. That might be an unusual case, but
I don't want to find out. So this is a national drop then?
Yes.
Okay. I remember in the 1970s when you brought that up, I remember a movie, I think it was reflective of society at that time, Warriors? Remember Warriors? It was the gangs that were traveling all over through New York. It was all these young people, and it's like,
Right.
I wonder if society was like that back then. So why do these young people do it?
Well, there are a number of factors, as you might expect, and it varies from kid to kid, but there's a few generalizations we can make. If you look at, and I've looked at a lot of, I've spoken with a lot of juvenile offenders, reviewed a lot of case files and so forth, and you see this in the research literature. There's kind of a typical profile, if you will, of a juvenile offender. A huge contributing factor is children who are not being well supervised. Either by their parents or by others. So in other words, they kind of have too much time on their hands, they fall in with the wrong crowd, one thing leads to another, and before you know it, they're off committing acts of delinquency. Frequently, these kids are often kids who have difficulty in school, who aren't doing well in school, so they'll start skipping school, and then when they skip school, they'll hang out with the wrong crowd, they'll get involved in maybe a little bit of drugs and alcohol, nobody's really supervising them or watching them, and before you know it, they're off involved in delinquency. Often with these kids as well, you see common mental health problems that many of them have. Many of them suffer from depression or ADD or ADHD, hyperactivity.
A severe case of it?
Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but these are kind of kids who are tend to be impulsive and so tend to maybe be depressed, and they're kind of trying to self-medicate through their depression by engaging in kind of thrill-seeking activities. And so you put all this toxic mix together, and it can lead to kids going down the wrong path, if you will.
Anything at all with conduct disorder?
Yes, conduct disorder is kind of just the medical term for children who get into problems with the law or get into problems at home or at school, kind of defying authority, behavior kind of problems. It's just kind of a medical term for a misbehaving kid, basically. Okay. And often it does involve law breaking, either of a minor variety or something more substantial.
They also don't they have some kind of, I don't know, it's sociopathy, but they're some kind of antisocial characteristics as well?
They can and they cannot. Most of these kids are not. Most of them you wouldn't diagnose as having a psychopathic personality. It's even controversial whether you can even diagnose that in childhood, although I think we're finding now you probably can. But most of these kids aren't psychopaths. But surely there are some, and particularly the ones that go on to become what we call life course criminals. You know, the ones who start offending at a very young age and progressively engage in more and more serious acts of criminal conduct.
Now, I guess the question everybody's probably going to want to know is, are there any commonalities in regards to socioeconomic statuses there, or poor socioeconomic environment? Is that a commonality for this?
I think the one thing I would point to is that another risk factor, there's what we call risk factors for juvenile delinquency, and I've already mentioned the key ones: drug and alcohol abuse, school failure, lack of adequate supervision, depression, hyperactivity, impulsive personality. Another one is living in a high crime neighborhood or a chaotic neighborhood, and the reasons for that are one, it exposes kids to that kind of environment and kind of models for them that kind of behavior. They see other people in the neighborhood, they're friends with other people in the neighborhood who are involved in that kind of activity, so it's more easy for them to get involved in it as well. These also, as well, tend to be oftentimes kids, again, who, for whatever reason, aren't as well supervised as they need to be, so they kind of get into trouble, fall in with the wrong crowd. That's, I think, the key risk factor that I would point to from that standpoint.
About developmental, is there anything there in regards to missing fathers, anything like that in commonality-wise?
We know from a lot of sociological research that it's easier for two parents to supervise and watch after a kid than one.
I can attest to that.
So it's not so much the issue of whether they have a father specifically or not, but more it's whether there's two parents in the home. Or more than one person who can supervise them and watch after them, maybe not even necessarily a parent. It is, having said that though, I'll also say that with some, as I said initially, violent crime really is the work of young men. And certainly there is a school of thought which says that it's particularly important for these young men to have positive male role models in their life, to be positively attached to an adult male in their life, whether that be a father or an uncle, and that some of these kids who don't have that kind of react in a negative way to not having that in their life. So I think that's certainly what I might call a protective factor if these young men have positive adult male role models in their life who kind of supervise them, mentor them, watch out for them, model for them appropriate behavior, and so forth.
Yeah, I love Dr. Redding's. Like having my own encyclopedia. So let's go to recidivism, and that's a word. I mentioned it to a couple of people about the show, and they just kind of looked at me. So what is recidivism first, so we can get everybody to make sure everybody's on the same page, and then what's going on with it?
Right. Recidivism refers to when an offender commits a crime, the likelihood that they're going to recommit a crime after they're either released from jail or the program of rehabilitation is finished. And generally speaking, when you talk about offenders, it varies depending on the type of offense you're talking about, whether you're talking, for example, about a sex offense where recidivism is very high, to other kinds of offenses, the age of the offender, and so forth. But in general, offending rates recidivism rates are not low, let's put it that way, generally speaking.
Really?
They tend to be fairly significant, especially for particular kinds of crimes. So sex offense have pretty high reoffending rates. Interestingly enough, violent crimes tend to have lower recidivism rates.
Really?
Yes. And that's because when people get involved in an act of violence, let's say they assault somebody else or even they kill somebody else, it's usually as a result of an argument, things get out of hand, there's some kind of conflict. It's not like when somebody's committing a property crime, they're a thief and they're planning to steal things, and that's kind of a very thought out, planned behavior that they have. It's not a spur of the moment, somebody gets angry and they hit somebody or they kill somebody or there's a fight or something like that.
Makes sense.
But the good news is that particularly when it comes to juveniles, we have, and this didn't used to be the case as recently as only 25, 30 years ago, but we now have pretty effective, scientifically developed rehabilitation programs for these kids, including even the very violent juvenile offenders that can reduce recidivism rates very dramatically.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute too. What's going on there? We know the rates are dropping.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Is there a difference between, we kind of lightly touched it before the show, between adults and children and youth, juveniles, I guess better said. You were mentioning there was a slight difference there in recidivism rate.
Well, let me put it this way. There is, if you can catch somebody when they're young rather than when they're older in committing a crime, the prospects for being able to intervene effectively to rehabilitate, to prevent them from recidivating are higher. So from that standpoint, if you were to ask me, everything else being equal, which would I be more hopeful about in terms of effectively rehabilitating an adult offender or a juvenile offender? I'd have to know specific information on the offender, of course, but everything else being equal, I'd probably say the juvenile offender.
Interesting. So let's start getting into it. What are some of the different ways that we're helping with our juveniles now? Because I know there's in-home probation, there's group or community-based probation. There's all different sorts. What's going on there? Yeah.
Well, let me talk about what we've found through a number of recent scientific studies to be the most effective way to rehabilitate these kids so they don't reoffend and recidivate. Interestingly enough, it's not sitting down and talking with the child. It's not doing one-on-one counseling.
It's not.
No, it's not talking to them about, why did you commit this crime? What were you thinking about at the time? What was going on in your life? That oftentimes can be useful as a part of the therapeutic process, especially for kids who have mental health problems. But really what's most effective is intervening in the risk factors I was talking about. So, for example, the kids may not be doing well in school, so you go into the school and you get them tutoring, or you work with the teachers to make them stay in school so they're not skipping school, so they're not dropping out of school. They oftentimes aren't well supervised, so you'll go in and work with the parents on being more effective in supervising the kid and disciplining the kid more effectively. The kid may have too much time on their hands, they may be falling in with the wrong crowd after school, so you try to get them away from those antisocial activities towards more pro-social activities. So you'll try to get the kid involved in after-school recreation or maybe mentoring program or a tutoring program or something. If the kid's involved in drugs or alcohol, you'll send them to a drug or alcohol treatment program. So it's kind of, I think a way to think about it is almost as doing social work with the kid rather than psychotherapy.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, it's because the reason these kids get involved in crime is for the kinds of due to the kinds of risk factors I was talking about. So if you can target that, what you do is you find out which risk factors are going on in the life of the individual kid you're working with, and you address those. As I say, you get the kid involved in pro-social activities. You find ways to get the kid away from hanging out with the wrong crowd that he's hanging out with. You find a way to get more mentors and positive adult role models in the child's life. You work with the parents and others involved with the child in more effectively supervising and disciplining the child. You work with the school to make sure that the kid isn't skipping school. And if you get all those things in place, chances are the kid's not going to have the opportunities, not going to have the time, and is not going to have the incentive to get involved in crime.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like they're crying out because they don't have something. So if they're not doing well at school, I got to get people's attention. I'm not doing well at school, and they're kind of almost crying out. I'm not sure.
That's certainly a part of it. That's certainly.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird way of looking at it, I guess, but it's different. So they're doing a lot of, and that sounds complicated.
It is. It's and I guess the downside to that is it takes a lot of resources to do that.
I was getting ready to ask.
What you need somebody who's well trained to the way that kind of rehabilitation is typically delivered is you have somebody, usually a psychologist, who's kind of in charge of making sure that those things get in place for the individual child, and then there's various people who will go in and work with the parents, work with the school system, and so forth. So you kind of need to have a team that's well trained, that knows how to do those kinds of things, and the child needs to be well evaluated at the outset to see exactly what the child's individual situation is, exactly what's going on in the child's life that's leading him or her to get involved in crime, and what the risk factors are operating in that child's life. But even though it doesn't come cheap, it's much cheaper than the cost of putting the child in prison or jail. It's much cheaper than the cost of, if the child goes out and commits future crimes, the cost of putting that child through the justice system again, potentially going to jail or prison or some kind of detention facility. So it's cost effective.
Oh, very much so. And they're also productive citizens of society if they're able not to go back to prison.
Exactly, and not to mention the cost of the crime that they otherwise might be committing.
That's right, yeah. That's excellent. Now, we mentioned earlier in the beginning of the show that the crime rates are going down. And we don't really know why. I think you were saying, is there a connection here?
There's been some speculation. For example, one theory is that the rates of lead poisoning in kids has been going down recently. Lead poisoning. One of the risks, and you may say, wow, what does that have to do with juvenile crime?
Never got that one.
One risk factor for kids getting involved in crime, or kids who have neurological problems, by that I'm referring to some kind of cognitive impairment, lower IQs, and certainly lead poisoning is a cause of that. And it used to be in the 60s and the 70s, and even in the early 80s, the rates of kids' exposure to lead in the environment was much higher than it should have been. So they got it through lead that was in paint, lead that was in various toxic chemicals that were used in buildings and other things. And the rates of that have gone down in recent years. And so that's one theory that's been put forth. Another theory, it may be partially due to some of these new rehabilitation programs that we've developed in recent years. We've also gotten away in recent years from putting kids in prison or juvenile facilities quite as much as we used to, which actually is bad for recidivism once they get out. It just kind of makes them more hardened criminals, if you will. It doesn't help.
So that's
them.
true. I've heard that before.
Yeah. Certainly when they're in the facility, they're off the street, so to speak, and not committing crime. But the point is, when they get out, then it's there have been some large-scale national studies done on this, which show that they have higher recidivism rates.
Is it because it becomes like an educational playground for them?
That's one thing. Another aspect to it is they're not being rehabilitated in the ways that we've just been talking about.
Sure.
They're in a facility, so nobody's going in and working with the parents. Nobody's going and working with the school system. Nobody's trying to. So again, when they get out of the facility,
same thing
as before. So. But we don't really know why the juvenile crime rate has been going down.
It's interesting, lead and then the rehabilitation programs. That's kind of fascinating. Could be a good combo.
Yeah.
Never thought about the lead.
One thing I am sure of, though, that it's not due solely to those two things. There are other things going on, I'm sure, but we just...
There's no silver bullet here.
Right.
Any differences in the relationship between... what was that program called? There was a program that they tried a while back ago with the police department. Scared Straight, I think, was there.
Oh, yes. That's a good question, because that's something people often ask about. There have been some empirical studies done which show that Scared Straight is not effective in rehabilitating kids. It makes a good deal of kind of intuitive common sense, so it's very appealing, but it doesn't have any positive effect. In fact, the studies would suggest it has a slight negative effect on increasing recidivism. And we speculate that the reason for that may be that on the one hand, it's not doing anything to rehabilitate the kids in the kinds of ways we've been talking about. And on the other hand, it may just lead a kid to kind of think, well, gee, they're treating me like a criminal. I must really be a criminal. And so kind of, why not? You know, why not?
Wow, that's a different spin.
So, yes, those programs have not been found to be effective.
What about DARE?
DARE is the drug education program. My understanding of the research on that is that it's been somewhat mixed, its effectiveness. So I think the jury on that is may still be out.
On the rehabilitation program, is it going on, or would it be advisable to have a better relationship with the law enforcement themselves, the local police department, holding events with the juveniles?
Yes, I think that's very useful, and there are some communities that are doing that. And if you can kind of get the community to what we call wrap around these children, so you get the school involved, you get law enforcement involved, you get their families involved, you get the local YMCA involved, and what have you, to build kind of a positive pro-social environment for these kids. And, so for example, we were talking before about the importance of mentors in these kids' lives. Mm-hmm. So if you could have some kind of mentoring program where local law enforcement, local police officers maybe act as mentors to some of these kids.
That'd be fantastic.
But that is something that I think is very positive.
I remember there's a story of a juvenile that I worked with a while back ago, really nice kid, and he was brought to me, and he had assaulted a police officer. Mm-hmm. It was a really bad time for him. He had a lot of issues going on at home. Mm-hmm. He was a little intoxicated, so he assaulted the police officer. Mm-hmm. Not a good start. And eventually, great story, he stopped drinking, and he ended up befriending the police officer, and they became friends. It was
great.
Really a neat little story.
That's great.
He was heading the wrong direction, quickly went back to the right direction. I think now he's even trying to be a police officer. So you never know. Dr. Redding, thank you so much again for being on The Circle. This was great stuff.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, we're there. See you next time, everyone. And also catch our web TV show, Circle of Insight, on therapycable.com.